Hi, my name is Cecelia Oliverio, and I'm a graduate student in Italian in the Department of Romance Languages and Literature at Harvard University. I'm pleased to welcome with us today Mary Jo Bona, guest lecturer for today's session of the 2011 Lauro de Bosis Colloquium Series. The chair of the Gender and Women's Studies Department and the director of the program in Italian American Studies at Stony Brook University, Dr. Bona will be presenting her most recent publication, By the Breath of Their Mouths, Narratives of Resistance in Italian America. Welcome, Mary Jo.
Thank you, Sam.
Now, your most recent book is a significant contribution to a growing and dynamic field of academic research, that is, Italian American Studies. What inspired your particular line of inquiry, and what was your main objective in writing and publishing this book?
Thank you. I think my main objective goes all the way back to 25 years ago when I started to work in the field of American literature and multi-ethnic American literature. And I want to respond to it in three ways. One, I wanted to continue to establish a still coalescing literary tradition, an attempt to organize a field of study of Italian American literature around and embracing a certain cohort or group of Italian American authors. All right, so that was the first concern that I had. The second was I wanted to scrutinize the ongoing effects of immigration down the generations, well after the second Great Migration of the great Italian diaspora from Italy to America and throughout the world, 1880 to 1920, coming to America. And third, while analyzing this literature, I kept hearing resonances of certain stories over and over again. And the stories that kept getting related started to take on a kind of conversation among the authors themselves. And I'm going to suggest that those resonances suggested something about what the authors were trying to say about how storytelling itself can be healing, can be liberatory, and can be resistant. All the way from the beginning of the literary tradition, which really pretty much begins in the 1880s with the political writers who came here, all the way through the millennium. So those are the three major reasons that I wanted to continue working in this field.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And your research has the quality in this book of a sort of archaeological endeavor, in the sense that you seek to rediscover and restore marginalized and forgotten works of literature. Mm-hmm. Among the numerous lesser-known works that you discuss, including the biographical account of the life of Rosa Cassetari by Marie Hall Etz and Mary Capello's Night Bloom, which do you find to be the most worthy of a revival and for what reason? And finally, which among these works is your personal favorite?
Okay, let me save personal favorite to the end because it's almost an impossible question to answer, but I love being asked it. Let's go to your question on worth. Because, in fact, one of the large questions that emerges out of English departments regarding all kinds of literature is it worthy enough to be taught? What criteria are used to make it clear to an audience of students that a specific literary work has value? Now, I have to be honest and autobiographical. I was nursed on high modernism. All right. So when I approached this literature for the first time, it's not unlikely that I would have chosen a text that was very experimental, that used social realism, but used it in an experimental way. So I'm referring specifically to Tina DeRosa's novel, Paper Fish. Okay? It's a very difficult novel, and I was raised with this notion that novels must be difficult. They must have a certain kind of stylistic nuance. But what made DeRosa's novel so beautiful for me was that it was also steeped in a kind of experiential reality that is related to a kind of migration experience and an experience in a specific ethnic enclave. So we'll get into Worth even later when we talk later on in the colloquium. But I at least wanted to be honest with you about how these questions continue to plague all ethnic literatures in the United States. Now let me go to your question on favorite. It's very difficult to choose a favorite novelist or writer. And when I was at the New York Museum of Art, we were at a conference about the Italian-American book back in 2000. And we were required as scholars to choose a favorite. And I happened at that time to be teaching a novel called Miss Giardino by Dorothy Calvetti Bryant. And what's beautiful about this book, I don't know if it's my favorite, but let's say it is for today. What's beautiful about this book is that, again, it uses a kind of modernist narrative technique in the service of immigrant issues and immigrant stories. So, and it's extremely teachable and very readable at the same time. So I'll choose that for today.
That sounds like a great choice. Hopefully we'll be discussing it even later on during the colloquium.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to our next question.
Okay.
When considering the writings of the authors that you studied, many of whom were the children and grandchildren of Italian immigrants, what differences were you able to note between the Italian-American culture of these writers and the broader American culture in which they also lived? And in addition, between Italian America and an Italy that could only be experienced through the stories and the memories of the ancestors of these authors?
That's a lovely question. Let me say something at the onset here. The ancestors and the immigrants who came to this country during and after the Second Great Migration did not understand themselves or identify themselves as American for quite a while. They identified themselves not as Italian either. They identified themselves regionally in terms of where the small homeland, paese, they came from. Having said that, they started to understand themselves as Italian from staying in America as long as they did. So they gained a kind of Italian identity by being in America. The writers who wrote early in the tradition, in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and the 1940s, were raised in a kind of dual tradition. A tradition at home in which the language, the dialect was spoken, and a tradition at school in which English was insisted upon and spoken. So they were able to write narratives about that duality in their experience of growing up to become Italian-American citizens. As the tradition goes on, and the writers get further away from the actual migratory experience, they do one of two things. They either return to Italy and resume a kind of relationship with the country as of new, or they continue to write about Italian-American experience through invention, through inventing or innovating on those stories that have been passed down to them. You have examples of both of those kinds of writers in the tradition. I'm thinking, once again, let's mention Tina DeRosa. On the other hand, Susan Caperna Lloyd, who went to Sicily and got involved in the procession of the Madonna out of the church and actually changed what it felt like to do that by being a carrier herself. So you'll see how the tradition continues to expand and change. And let me say one more thing. There's this recurring image in Italian-American writing, mostly by women writers, but also by men, of the myth of Demeter and Persephone. So you see the mother-daughter theme emerging out of this literature, and it takes those writers also back to Sicily and Italy to rethink their narrative and ancestral pasts.
Thank you very much. And maybe if we could just close with one more question. I'd like to know, where do you hope to see the field of Italian-American studies within the next 10 years?
I think that it's someplace else now than it was 20 years ago, I'm happy to say. And I do think that one of the ways to strengthen a field of cultural study is to do comparative methodology, to make a specific field get connected to another field. So comparative methodologies are very useful. You can do that historically by looking at Italian-American migration along with Italian migrations to other countries like South America and Australia. You can do it in terms of literature by comparing a specific ethnic Italian-American group with, as I have done, with the African-American, and the way in which the trajectory of those traditions intersect, and they challenge and change each other through the conversation of both. So that's where I see the profession going in the future, that we're not going to just be single ethnic groups, but in fact we're going to be connecting to other ways of thinking about migration and mobility in the United States and beyond as we become a more global society.
Thank you, Professor Bona, for having joined us here at Harvard today and also for having shared your insight.
Thank you so much.